everybody, my name is Timothy and I would like to welcome you to the Asian Civilizations channel. Imagine standing here at sunrise. Before you stretches a vast plain in central Myanmar, dotted with thousands of temples and pagodas. Some rise proudly above the trees, others are little more than weathered brick ruins, half hidden among the vegetation. For centuries, this was one of the great sacred landscapes of Asia. But who built all these temples and why? Today, Bagan is one of Myanmar's most remarkable destinations. Visitors come here to see its temples, climb viewpoints, study its murals and inscriptions, and experience a landscape unlike almost anywhere else in the world. But Bagan was not always an archaeological site. Nearly 1,000 years ago, this was the heart of a powerful kingdom. Its rulers controlled much of the Irrawaddy Valley. Its merchants traveled along the river and across the wider world of Asia. Its farmers cultivated the land, its craftsmen produced exquisite works of art, and its monks and scholars helped establish Buddhism at the center of the kingdom's cultural life. And its kings built temples, they built monasteries, they built stupas, and they built them on a scale that would transform the landscape forever. But the story of Pagan is much more than a story about temples. It is the story of how a kingdom emerged from the landscape of the Irrawaddy Valley and gradually became one of the most important centers of power in mainland Southeast Asia. It is the story of kings and warriors, farmers and merchants, monks and craftsmen. It is also a story of ideas. For Pagan's rulers, political power and religious devotion became deeply intertwined. Buddhism provided not merely a faith, but a framework through which kings could demonstrate their piety, accumulate merit, and present themselves as guardians of the religious order. Over generations, this relationship between kingship, wealth, land, and religion would produce one of the most extraordinary architectural landscapes in the medieval world. Yet, Pagan's rise did not happen in isolation. Long before its great temples dominated the landscape, other peoples had already established cities, traded across Asia, and embraced Buddhism in the lands that would become Myanmar. The Pagan civilization inherited much more from this older world. It absorbed ideas, technologies, artistic traditions, and religious practices from its neighbors, from the Mon and Pew to India and Sri Lanka, and then it transformed them into something distinctly its own. This is why the story of Pagan is also a story about connection. Myanmar stood at a crossroads between the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, between the great river systems of the mainland and the maritime routes that connected the wider Asian world. Through these connections, Pagan became part of a much larger Asian civilization while still developing a character unmistakably its own. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Pagan is what happened after its kingdom disappeared. The political order eventually fragmented, its rulers passed into history, its capital ceased to be the center of a great empire, and yet the temples remained. They endured centuries of weather, neglect, earthquakes, and political change. People continued to worship in them, pilgrims continue to visit them, and today, the ancient landscape of Pagan has become one of Myanmar's greatest cultural treasures. So, how did this extraordinary civilization begin? How did a kingdom on the banks of the Irrawaddy rise to become the heart of a powerful Buddhist world? Who was the king who transformed Pagan's fortune? And how did religion, agriculture, trade, and royal ambition combine to create a landscape of thousands of temples? To answer those questions, we have to travel back before the great temples, before the mighty kings, and even before Pagan became the dominant power of Myanmar. We begin with the land itself, the Irrawaddy Valley, a landscape where rivers, monsoon rains, and dry plains would shape the destiny of an emerging civilization. That is where our story begins. Chapter 1: The Land Between River and Dry Zone. What kind of civilization could emerge in one of the driest regions of Southeast Asia? When we picture Myanmar, we might imagine dense tropical forests, golden pagodas, or the great Irrawaddy River winding through the country. But central Myanmar tells a different story. Here, between the mountains to the west and east, lies a vast dry zone where the climate can be surprisingly harsh. Rainfall is seasonal, temperatures can be high, and agriculture has always depended upon making careful use of water. And yet, it was here, in this seemingly unforgiving landscape, that one of the greatest civilizations of medieval Southeast Asia would eventually emerge. The Irrawaddy was the great artery of this world. Flowing from the northern mountains towards the Andaman Sea, the river connected different ecological zones and made movement possible across a landscape where traveling overland could be difficult. People could travel by boat, goods could be transported along the river, ideas could move with merchants, monks, and migrants, and agricultural communities could settle where water was available. The river, therefore, did much more than provide water, it connected people. But water was never equally available. The people of central Myanmar had to adapt to a landscape governed by the rhythms of the monsoon. During the rainy season, streams and rivers could swell dramatically. During the dry season, the landscape could become dusty and parched. This seasonal cycle made water management essential. Communities learned to dig wells, construct reservoirs, channel water, and cultivate crops according to the availability of moisture. Over time, these techniques would become increasingly sophisticated. Agriculture was the foundation of settled life. Rice could be cultivated where sufficient water was available, while other crops and forms of subsistence helped communities survive in the drier areas. Livestock, fishing, gathering, and trade supplemented farming. This mixture of river resources and agricultural production allowed communities to grow larger and more permanent. And as communities grew, so did the need for organization. Someone had to manage water, someone had to coordinate labor, someone had to protect settlements and regulate the distribution of resources. These were the beginning of political power. The geography of central Myanmar also offered another advantage. The region stood between different worlds. To the west lay the Indian subcontinent. To the east were the great river valleys and kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia. To the north were roads leading towards Yunnan and southern China. And through the rivers and coastal waterways, communities could connect with the wider Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian trading networks. Myanmar was not an isolated corner of Asia, it was a crossroad. These connections mattered because civilization is rarely created by geography alone. Ideas traveled with people, technologies traveled with traders, religious traditions traveled with monks and pilgrims. And artistic styles could cross enormous distances carried by merchants, craftsmen, and rulers seeking prestige. Long before the Pagan kingdom reached its height, the peoples of Myanmar were already participating in these wider networks of exchange. And among the most important of the societies that came before Pagan were the Piyu. They built cities, they developed systems of writing, they practiced Buddhism, and they maintained connections extending far beyond the Irrawaddy Valley. The Piyu would become an important part of the story of how civilization developed in Myanmar. But they were not the only people shaping this region. The Mon were developing their own centers further south. Indian religious and cultural influences were entering the region, and populations speaking different languages and following different traditions were interacting across the valleys and plains. The Myanmar of this early period was therefore already a multicultural world. Pagan would eventually rise within that world, absorbing influences from the societies around it and transforming them into something new. But before we meet Pagan, we need to understand the people who came before it. By the time Pagan began to rise, the foundations of civilization in Myanmar were already centuries old. The river had provided movement, the dry zone had demanded adaptation, agriculture had created settled communities, trade had connected them to distant lands, and older kingdoms had demonstrated that cities, religion, and political authority could flourish in the Irrawaddy world. Pagan would inherit all of this, but it would also transform it. And that transformation would eventually produce one of the most remarkable capitals in medieval Asia. The story of Pagan, therefore, did not begin with its kings. It began with a landscape and with peoples who had learned how to live within it. But who were these earlier people? What did their cities look like? And how did their religious and cultural traditions help shape the kingdom that would eventually rise at Pagan? In chapter 2, we would go further back to the Piyu, the Mon, and the early societies whose legacies would become part of the civilization of Pagan. Chapter 2, Before Pagan, the Piyu and the Early Kingdoms. What if the civilization of Pagan was not really the beginning of Myanmar's history, but the culmination of a much older story? Long before the temples of Bagan filled the horizon, cities had already risen across the plain of central Myanmar. Among the most important were the cities of the Piyu. The Piyu were an ancient people who established several urban centers across the Irrawaddy Valley and surrounding region. Their cities flourished centuries before Pagan became a major power, and their culture was deeply connected with the wider Buddhist world of Asia. One of the most important Piyu cities was Sri Kesitra near modern Phrae. At its height, Sri Kesitra was an enormous urban center surrounded by massive walls and moat. Within and around the city were Buddhist monuments, residential areas, agricultural land, and water management systems. It was not simply a collection of houses, it was an organized urban society. The scale of Sri Kesitra reminds us that complex civilization in Myanmar existed long before the rise of Pagan. The Piyu world was also connected to distant places. Archaeological discoveries reveal links with India and China, while Chinese historical records describe Piyu societies and their cities. Buddhism became deeply established among the Piyu, although their religious landscape was never exclusively Buddhist. Other beliefs and traditions existed alongside it. This mixture of local traditions and imported ideas would become an enduring characteristic of Myanmar's religious culture. The Piyu also developed systems of writing and administration. Their inscriptions provide evidence of an organized society with religious institutions, rulers, and economic activity. Their cities were connected to agricultural hinterlands that supplied food and resources, and their position along roads between India, China, and Southeast Asia gave them access to ideas and goods from far beyond Myanmar. In other words, the Pure were already participating in the international world of their time. Yet, the Pure were only one part of the cultural world that surrounded the future Pagan kingdom. To the south lived the Mon, whose societies developed particularly strong connections with the Buddhist traditions of the Indian Ocean world. The Mon centers became important conduits through which Indian cultural and religious influences reached mainland Southeast Asia. Through these networks came more than religion. There were scripts, literary traditions, architectural ideas, artistic styles, and concepts of kingship that would later influence kingdoms throughout the region. The influence of India was particularly important. Buddhism had traveled across the Bay of Bengal for centuries, carried by monks, merchants, and pilgrims. Along with Buddhism came Sanskrit and Pali literary traditions, new artistic forms, and ideas about sacred kingship. But these influences were not simply copied. The peoples of Myanmar adapted them. They combined them with their own traditions, languages, and beliefs. And that process of adaptation would become one of the defining characteristics of civilization that eventually emerged at Pagan. By the 9th century, however, the balance of power in the Irrawaddy Valley was beginning to change. The old Pure city-states were declining, new populations were moving into central Myanmar. Among them were the Burma, whose language and culture would eventually become dominant in the region. At this stage, however, there was no unified Burmese kingdom. There were competing settlements, local rulers, and overlapping cultural traditions. The future Pagan kingdom was still taking shape. The arrival and expansion of the Burma did not mean that the older cultures simply disappeared. Instead, Myanmar became a place where traditions overlap. Pure influences survived, Mon culture remained powerful, Indian religious traditions continued to flow into the region, and local beliefs remained deeply rooted in communities. The civilization of Pagan would eventually emerge from this mixture. That is important because Pagan was not created from nothing. It was a synthesis. And nowhere was this synthesis more important than in the development of Buddhism. By the time Pagan emerged as a major political center, Buddhism was already deeply rooted in Myanmar. But it existed alongside older traditions, particularly beliefs in nuts, supernatural beings associated with places, nature, and human experience. Rather than simply eliminating these older beliefs, Burmese Buddhism would eventually incorporate them into a much broader religious world. This ability to absorb and transform outside influences would become one of Pagan's greatest strengths. Then something remarkable happened. The old Pure centers weakened, political power shifted toward the central Irrawaddy Valley, and one settlement, positioned beside the river in the dry zone, began to grow in importance. Its name was Pagan, in Burmese, Bagan. At first, it was simply one center among several, but its location gave it enormous potential. It sat beside the Irrawaddy, it was close to productive agricultural land, and it occupied a strategic position from which rulers could reach both the northern and southern parts of the valley. From this point forward, the story begins to accelerate. The landscape was ready, the agricultural base was developing, the religious traditions were established. The cultural influences of Pure, Mon, and wider Buddhist world had been absorbed and adapted. What was missing was political leadership powerful enough to bring these ingredients together. And in the 11th century, that leadership would emerge. His name was Anawrahta. Under him, Pagan would cease to be merely an important settlement. It would become the center of a kingdom, and that kingdom would change the history of Myanmar forever. The age of Pagan was about to begin. In chapter 3, we would meet the king who would transform this rising settlement into the heart of one of Southeast Asia's great medieval kingdoms, Anawrahta. Chapter 3, The Rise of Pagan. How does a small river settlement become the heart of a kingdom? By the beginning of the 11th century, Pagan was no longer simply an obscure settlement beside the Irrawaddy. It was becoming a center of political power in the dry zone of central Myanmar. The exact early history of Pagan is difficult to reconstruct. Later Burmese chronicles preserve traditions about its earliest rulers, but the surviving evidence becomes much firmer from the 11th century onward. And then, in 1044, a new king came to the throne. His name was Anawrahta. Anawrahta inherited a kingdom that was still relatively small compared with the great powers of Asia. Yet Pagan possessed something enormously valuable: its position. The city stood on the Irrawaddy, the great north-south artery of Myanmar. From here, rulers could control river traffic, communicate with settlements further north and south, and draw resources from the agricultural communities of the surrounding dry zone. The river that had once simply connected communities was becoming the foundation of political power. But Anawrahta was not content simply to inherit Pagan. He set about expanding its influence. Military campaigns, alliances, and political consolidation brought surrounding territories increasingly into Pagan's orbit. The process was gradual. There was no single movement when every part of what we now call Myanmar suddenly became one country. Instead, Anawrahta built a powerful center of authority in the Irrawaddy Valley, and his successors would continue extending and consolidating that influence. This distinction matters. Pagan was becoming an empire through a process of expansion and integration. The expansion of Pagan also brought it into contact with older and more established cultures. To the south were the Mon lands, particularly the important centers of lower Myanmar. To the west lay Arakan and the roads toward Bengal and India. To the north were the territories connected to Yunnan and the Chinese world. Anawrahta's Pagan was therefore growing not in isolation but within a complicated political landscape. And this meant that conquest was only part of the story. Pagan also had to absorb people, traditions, and knowledge. Among the most important influences was the Buddhist culture of the Mon. Pagan's rulers encountered religious traditions that had developed over centuries and were connected to the wider Buddhist world. Anawrahta became an important patron of Buddhism, but the religious transformation of Pagan was not simply a matter of replacing one belief system with another. The kingdom already possessed its own religious traditions. Buddhism existed alongside local beliefs, including the worship of gnats, spirits associated with particular places, people, and forces of nature. Pagan would eventually develop a distinctive religious culture in which these traditions existed alongside one another. Anawrahta's religious ambitions were also connected with politics. A growing kingdom needed more than military victories. It needed institutions, it needed a shared cultural language, and it needed a source of legitimacy that could reach beyond individual clans and local rulers. Buddhism offered part of that framework. The king could present himself as a patron and protector of the Buddhist faith, while religious institutions helped connect communities across the expanding kingdom. This relationship between kingship and Buddhism would become one of the defining features of Pagan civilization. But religion was not the only force strengthening Pagan. Agriculture provided the material foundation. The dry zone could be difficult to farm, yet the communities around Pagan had developed methods for managing water and cultivating the land. As Pagan expanded, its rulers could draw upon the agricultural production of an increasingly large territory. Grain fed the population, surplus supported armies and officials, and the movement of agricultural goods along the Irrawaddy connected the countryside with the capital. The kingdom was beginning to function as an integrated economic system. The Irrawaddy was equally important to trade. Boats carried rice, timber, pottery, textile, and other goods between communities. Merchants could travel further than they could by land. And Pagan's position along the river gave its rulers an important advantage in controlling movement and exchange. The capital was therefore becoming more than a royal residence, it was becoming a hub. People, goods, ideas, and religious traditions were converging here. As Pagan's political and economic importance grew, so too did its ability to mobilize labor. This would have enormous consequences. Brickmakers, builders, sculptors, painters, and craftsmen could be brought together for ambitious projects. Temples could be constructed on a scale that would have been impossible for a small village. Religious donations could be transformed into permanent monuments. And the landscape around Pagan slowly began to change. The first great age of temple construction was approaching. Anawrahta's reign therefore marked a turning point. Pagan had grown from a regional settlement into the center of an expanding kingdom. The Irrawaddy had become its highway. Agriculture supplied its wealth. Military power extended its influence. And Buddhism was becoming deeply intertwined with royal authority. Yet, Anawrahta's greatest legacy may have been the political foundation he created for the rulers who followed him. Because Pagan's story did not end with Anawrahta. In many ways, it was only beginning. After Anawrahta's death in 1077, his successors would continue the work of consolidation. The kingdom would become wealthier, its connections with neighboring regions would deepen, Buddhist institutions would grow, and the number of religious monuments would begin to multiply across the Pagan plain. The modest skyline of Anawrahta's time would gradually become something extraordinary. A landscape of brick, a landscape of stupas, a landscape of temples, and eventually a landscape unlike anything else in medieval Asia. The rise of Pagan was therefore not the story of one man alone. Anawrahta was crucial, but he inherited a landscape already shaped by centuries of cultural exchange. What he did was bring many of those forces together: political power, agriculture, river trade, Buddhism, and the traditions of earlier Myanmar societies. Pagan had become a kingdom. Now it was ready to become a civilization. And that transformation would be driven by one force above all others: religion. In Chapter 4, we explore Anawrahta's Buddhist transformation of Pagan and how a king's religious vision would help shape the spiritual foundation of Myanmar. Chapter 4, the Buddhist transformation. When Anawrahta became king, Pagan already possessed its own religious traditions. Buddhism was present. So were older beliefs associated with spirits, sacred places, and the forces of nature. And among the religious specialists of the kingdom were the Ari, whose practices were different from the form of Theravada Buddhism that would eventually dominate Myanmar. Anawrahta's reign would change this religious landscape profoundly. According to Buddhist tradition, a major turning point came when Anawrahta encountered a monk named King Anawrahta. King Anawrahta was associated with the non-Buddhist world of Lower Myanmar and became one of Anawrahta's most important religious advisors. He is traditionally credited with encouraging the king to embrace a more orthodox form of Theravada Buddhism. Whether every detail of the later chronicles is historically accurate or not, the broader transformation is unmistakable. Pagan was becoming a major center of Buddhist learning and patronage. The king's conversion was not merely personal. Religion and political authority were closely connected in the medieval world. A king who became a great patron of Buddhism could gain legitimacy as a righteous ruler. Monasteries could receive land and wealth. Monks could travel across the kingdom. And Buddhist institutions could provide a shared cultural framework for communities that had previously belonged to different local traditions. In this way, religion became part of the process of state building. Yet, Anawrahta did not simply erase the older religious traditions of his kingdom. This is one of the most fascinating features of Burmese religious history. Buddhism and the worship of deaths developed alongside one another. The spirits of the older world did not simply disappear when Buddhist temples appeared. Instead, they were incorporated into a broader religious landscape. People could visit a Buddhist shrine and still honor the spirits believed to protect their homes, villages, and communities. This religious flexibility would become characteristic of Pagan. Buddhism provided the kingdom with an increasingly sophisticated intellectual and spiritual tradition. But local beliefs remained deeply embedded in everyday life. The result was not a simple replacement of one religion with another. It was a process of layering. And this layering would eventually give Myanmar one of the most distinctive religious cultures in Southeast Asia. But the transformation of Pagan was also connected with the wider Buddhist world. Monks and religious scholars traveled between Myanmar, India, Sri Lanka, and the Buddhist centers of mainland Southeast Asia. Manuscripts circulated, doctrines were debated, monastic traditions were compared, and Buddhist art and architecture crossed political boundaries. Pagan was increasingly becoming part of a vast religious network stretching across the Bay of Bengal and mainland Southeast Asia. This wider connection would have profound consequences. Pagan's rulers could draw upon religious knowledge from beyond their own kingdom. Craftsmen could learn new artistic techniques. Architects could experiment with different forms, and royal patrons could use Buddhist monuments to demonstrate their wealth, devotion, and authority. The temple was therefore never merely a place of worship. It was also a statement. A king who built a temple was making his presence permanent. And soon, Pagan rulers began to express their devotion on an unprecedented scale. Brick became the dominant material, stupas rose above the plain, temples were built with vaulted interiors, walls were decorated with sculptured images and paintings. The sacred landscape was beginning to change. What had once been a political settlement was becoming a city of religion. One of the earliest great monuments associated with this transformation was the Shwezigon Pagoda. Its construction was begun during Anawrahta's reign and completed under his successor Chiansita. The Great Golden Stupa would become one of the most important religious monuments of Pagan. It represented something larger than architecture. It embodied the relationship between kingship, Buddhism, and merit-making that would define Pagan civilization. But perhaps the most important consequence of Buddhist patronage was the creation of merit. In Buddhist thought, generous acts, particularly supporting the Sangha and construction of religious monuments, could generate spiritual merit. For kings, this had an additional political dimension. A ruler became the kingdom's greatest donor. His generosity could be seen as evidence of his righteousness, and the temples and monasteries he supported became enduring symbols of his legitimacy. The relationship between religion and political power was therefore becoming increasingly intimate. The king protected the faith, the religious institutions supported the king's legitimacy, the population gained opportunities to accumulate merit, and the landscape filled with monuments that made the relationship visible. Pagan was developing a system in which religion was not separate from society. It was woven into the fabric of the kingdom itself. Yet, there was another important development. Pagan was not only receiving Buddhist traditions from elsewhere, it was beginning to develop its own distinctive artistic language. Sculptors adopted Buddhist images to local tastes. Architects experimented with brick vaulting and temple forms. Painters covered interior walls with scenes from the life of the Buddha and Buddhist cosmology. The craftsmen developed techniques that would produce some of the finest religious art in medieval Southeast Asia. The artistic transformation was only beginning. Over the next 2 centuries, Bagan would become one of the greatest centers of Buddhist architecture anywhere in Asia. Thousands of religious monuments would eventually rise across its plain. Some would be enormous, others would be intimate shrines built by ordinary donors. Together, they would create the extraordinary sacred landscape we associated with Bagan today. But that landscape was not created overnight. It was the product of generations of devotion. And the religious transformation of Pagan had consequences far beyond the temple walls. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning. Monks taught reading, religious doctrine, and moral instruction. Manuscripts were copied. Knowledge was preserved. The kingdom was developing an intellectual culture as well as a monumental one. Pagan was no longer simply building temples, it was building a civilization. By now, the transformation begun under Anawrahta was producing something much larger than a royal religious reform. It was creating a shared cultural world. A farmer in the countryside could make a donation to a monastery. A merchant could finance a shrine, a king could build a monumental temple, a monk could travel from one end of the kingdom to another, and all of them participated in different ways in the Buddhist culture of Pagan. And this is perhaps the key to understanding Bagan. Its temples were not merely monuments to dead kings. They were the physical expression of a living religious culture. Some were commissioned by rulers, many were supported by wealthy families and officials. Others reflected the devotion of individuals whose names history has forgotten. Each monument added another layer to the sacred landscape, and together those layers would eventually create one of the greatest archaeological sites in Asia. But the greatest age of Pagan was still ahead. Anawrahta had laid the foundation, his successors would expand it, the kingdom would become richer and more powerful. The temple building tradition would reach extraordinary proportions. And under later rulers, Pagan would become the capital of a kingdom whose influence stretched across much of mainland Southeast Asia. The plain that we see today, dotted with thousands of surviving monuments, was about to become one of the most spectacular sacred landscapes in the medieval world. The transformation had begun with a king and a monk, but it would carry forward by generations, and soon Pagan would reach the height of its power. In chapter 5, we enter Pagan's golden age, when kings such as Chiansita and Alonsitu turned the kingdom into a great center of power, wealth, architecture, and Buddhist culture. Chapter 5, the Golden Age of Pagan. What happens when a kingdom discovers that its greatest source of power is not simply conquest, but prosperity? By the late 11th century, Pagan was becoming much more than the kingdom Anawrahta had inherited. Its rulers controlled important stretches of the Irrawaddy. Agricultural production sustained a growing population. Buddhist institutions were flourishing, and across the plain around the capital, temples and stupas were multiplying. But the kingdom was about to enter an even more remarkable phase. After Anawrahta's death in 1077, his successors continued to strengthen the kingdom. But among them, one ruler stands out for the remarkable cultural flowering associated with his reign. His name was Chiansita. He ruled from 1084 to 1112 and became one of the most celebrated kings of Pagan history. Under Chiansita, Pagan's political and religious institutions became more firmly established, while architecture and art reached new levels of sophistication. Chiansita's reign is closely associated with one of the masterpieces of Pagan architecture, the Ananda Temple. Built in the early 12th century, the Ananda represented a remarkable synthesis of Buddhist artistic traditions. Its architecture reflects influences from across the Buddhist world, yet the finished monument is unmistakably Pagan. Inside, vast standing images of the Buddha face the cardinal directions. The walls and corridors create an experience that is both architectural and spiritual. The Ananda was more than an impressive building. It was an expression of Pagan's confidence. The kingdom could now mobilize architects, craftsmen, sculptors, and laborers on a scale that rivaled the great Buddhist centers of Asia. Ideas could travel across thousands of kilometers and be transformed into something distinctly local. Pagan was no longer merely receiving influences from abroad, it was creating its own artistic tradition. The religious monuments of Pagan also became repositories of art. Inside temples, artists painted scenes from Buddhist scriptures and stories of the Buddha's previous lives. Sculptors created images of extraordinary refinement. Decorative details covered walls, doorways, and terraces. The temple became a canvas upon which Pagan's artists could express both religious devotion and technical mastery. But Pagan's golden age was not confined to architecture. The kingdom had become an important center of trade. The Irrawaddy connected Pagan with regions to the north and south, while routes beyond Myanmar connected it to India, Sri Lanka, China, and mainland Southeast Asia. Merchants carried textiles, ceramics, precious materials, and agricultural products. The capital was increasingly cosmopolitan. The river was central to this prosperity. Pagan's control of river transport allowed its rulers to move people and resources across vast territory. Grain could travel downstream, timber could be transported from forested regions, craft goods could reach distant markets, and royal authority could extend along the same routes. The Irrawaddy was both an economic highway and an instrument of political power. This growing wealth allowed Pagan's rulers to support something that would become almost unimaginable in scale: temple construction, monasteries, stupas, libraries, religious halls, across the plain, brick structures began appearing one after another. Some were enormous royal foundations, others were comparatively modest shrines built by individuals seeking merit. Together, they transformed the landscape. And behind this building boom was an idea that had already shaped Pagan from the beginning: merit. To give was to accumulate merit. To support the Sangha was meritorious. To construct a religious monument was meritorious. And for kings, extraordinary generosity could demonstrate their role as righteous Buddhist rulers. The result was a remarkable cycle. Wealth supported religious construction, religious constructions generated prestige and merit, and the monuments themselves reinforced the authority of the kingdom. The great monuments also created employment and specialized knowledge. Brickmakers needed to understand materials, architects needed to calculate proportions, builders needed to master the difficult art of constructing vaulted brick interiors. Painters needed knowledge of pigments, sculptors needed extraordinary technical skills. Pagan was becoming a sophisticated urban economy built partly around religion. Under Chiensita, Pagan also developed a stronger connection with the wider Buddhist world. The kingdom's rulers maintained religious relationships with Sri Lanka and other Buddhist centers. Monks and texts traveled, and the religious traditions of Theravada Buddhism continued to develop. This was not a closed civilization. Pagan was deeply connected to the wider world of Asia. After Chiensita, another ruler continued the expansion of Pagan's power and culture. His name was Alon Situ. He ruled for much of the 12th century, and under him, Pagan's influence continued to expand. The kingdom was now wealthy, sophisticated, and firmly established as one of the major powers of mainland Southeast Asia. Alon Situ was also a major patron of architecture. Among the monuments associated with his reign is the That Bin Yu Temple, one of the tallest structures on the Pagan plain. Rising dramatically above its surroundings, it demonstrates the confidence of a civilization that had mastered monumental brick architecture. The temples of Pagan were becoming not merely places of worship, but landmarks visible from across the landscape. Another extraordinary monument associated with Alon Situ is the Damayanchi Temple, although its construction was completed under a later ruler. Its massive brick walls demonstrate the extraordinary resources that Pagan's rulers could command. The sheer quantity of material required for these monuments tells us something important. Behind the beauty was organization. Thousands of people had to quarry, mold, transport, and place bricks. The temples were monuments to faith, but also to the administrative capacity of the kingdom. By the 12th century, Pagan had become something remarkable. It was a capital, a religious center, a commercial hub, a center of scholarship and craftsmanship, and the heart of a kingdom whose influence reached far beyond the walls of its city. But perhaps its most extraordinary achievement was something that could not be measured in military victories or trade revenues. It was the transformation of the landscape itself. Imagine approaching Pagan from the river. At first, you might see only the dry plains. Then a stupa appears, then another, and suddenly the horizon seems to fill with brick towers, domes, and temple roofs. The sacred landscape stretches further than the eye can easily comprehend. This was the physical expression of generations of Buddhist devotion. UNESCO today describes Pagan as an exceptional sacred landscape with 3,595 recorded monuments, including stupas, temples and other Buddhist structures. Yet this was not simply a city of kings. The people who created Bagan's monuments came from every level of society. Kings provided enormous patronage, nobles and officials established monasteries, merchants and wealthy families commissioned temples, ordinary people contributed offerings and labor. The landscape was therefore a collective creation. The civilization had literally built itself into the earth. By the end of the 12th century, Pagan stood at the center of a sophisticated regional civilization. Its rulers had built an extensive political network. Its merchants traveled along the Irrawaddy and beyond. Its monasteries preserved knowledge. Its craftsmen created extraordinary works of art. And its temples had transformed the landscape into a monumental expression of Buddhist devotion. But the Golden Age was not yet over. The greatest concentration of monuments would come in the 13th century, and with prosperity came new challenges. Pagan has reached the height of its confidence, but the very institutions that had made the kingdom magnificent would eventually place enormous demands upon it. Land was increasingly dedicated to religious institutions. Taxable resources became tied up in monasteries and temples. The state had to maintain irrigation, administration, and defense across a large territory. And beyond Pagan, the political landscape of Asia was changing. The next century would bring both the greatest flowering of Pagan civilization and the first sign of serious strain. Pagan's golden age had therefore created a paradox. The kingdom had become extraordinarily powerful because of its ability to mobilize wealth, labor, religion, and political authority. But maintaining that system would become increasingly difficult. For now, however, the temples still rose, the monasteries still flourished, the Irrawaddy still carried boats, and across the Pagan plain, one of the greatest Buddhist civilizations in Asia stood at the height of its glory. Bagan has become one of the great civilizations of medieval Asia. But history rarely allows a golden age to last forever. In chapter 6, we enter Pagan's 13th century zenith and begin to see the pressures that would eventually bring this extraordinary kingdom toward decline. Chapter 6, the twilight of Pagan. For more than 2 centuries, Pagan had grown in wealth, influence, and splendor. Its rulers had unified much of the Irrawaddy basin. Its monks and scholars had helped establish Theravada Buddhism as the dominant religious tradition. And its builders had transformed the landscape into one of the greatest sacred cities in Asia. But by the 13th century, the very success of Pagan was beginning to create new problems. The kingdom had reached its zenith, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the foundation beneath that grandeur were beginning to weaken. One of the great engines of Pagan's prosperity had been religious patronage. Kings donated land, they donated villages, they endowed monasteries, and wealthy families followed their example. These gifts generated religious merit, but they could also remove land and labor from the taxable resources available to the state. Over generations, enormous amounts of wealth became attached to Buddhist institutions. The monuments that testify to Pagan's greatness therefore also reveal one of the kingdom's growing vulnerabilities. The problem was not Buddhism itself, nor was it simply the number of temples. The deeper issue was the relationship between religious wealth and political power. A king who wished to demonstrate his piety was expected to give generously. But every new religious endowment could reduce the resources available for taxation and administration. and Pagan rulers still had to govern provinces, maintain irrigation, support the court, and defend the kingdom. The balance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. At the same time, Pagan rulers faced another challenge. The kingdom was becoming increasingly dependent on the agricultural productivity of the dry zone. Irrigation was essential. The great rivers could sustain agriculture, but only if water was carefully managed. The ability to control land and water had helped create Pagan's power. Now, maintaining that system required enormous administrative effort. For generations, Pagan had successfully turned the dry plains around the Irrawaddy into productive farmland. But maintaining irrigation was not a task that could simply be inherited. It required coordination, it required labor, and above all, it required an effective state. As the central authority weakened, the system that supported the kingdom could become increasingly difficult to manage. The problem was therefore larger than the temples themselves. It was the gradual weakening of the machinery that held Pagan together. And yet, Pagan was magnificent. This is important. Decline did not mean immediate collapse. During the 13th century, temples continued to be built, religious life continued to flourish, pilgrims still traveled across the sacred plains, and kingdom remained wealthy enough to produce extraordinary monuments. From the ground, Pagan may still have looked like a civilization at the height of its power. Indeed, the 13th century produced some of Pagan's most impressive monuments. But behind the religious splendor, political authority was becoming more complicated. The king was no longer the only powerful figure. Provincial leaders, military commanders, wealthy families, and religious institutions all possessed their own resources and influence. The kingdom was becoming increasingly decentralized. Then came a new power from far beyond the Irrawaddy Valley. To the north, the Mongol Empire had become the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. Its armies had conquered vast territories across Central and East Asia. By the late 13th century, Mongol power had reached the borders of the Pagan realm. For Pagan, the world beyond its northern frontier was changing dramatically. Pagan's rulers now had to make difficult decisions. Should they resist? Should they negotiate? Or could they simply avoid provoking a power that had already overwhelmed kingdoms across Asia? The answer would prove increasingly complicated. The Burmese court attempted diplomacy, but relations deteriorated. Meanwhile, the Mongols pushed southward. The threat was no longer distant. It had reached the kingdom's northern frontier. The confrontation eventually became military. In the 1270s and 1280s, Mongol forces advanced into the northern territories of the Pagan realm. From here, we need to be careful with one of the most persistent stories about Pagan's fall. For generations, popular accounts have portrayed the Mongols as simply invading Pagan, sacking the capital, and bringing the kingdom crashing down. The reality appears to have been considerably more complicated. UNESCO's assessment notes that the conventional story of a direct Mongol invasion and sack of Pagan in the 1280s rests on limited evidence. A longer process of political and economic weakening is now considered more persuasive. The Mongol threat exposed weaknesses that had been developing for decades. The Pagan state had become increasingly difficult to control from the capital. Provincial authorities were becoming more powerful. The economy had been strained by generations of religious endowments and monumental construction. and the royal court was struggling to maintain authority over distant regions. The Mongol pressure did not create all these problems, it accelerated them. In 1287, King Anawrahta was killed after fleeing from the advancing Mongol forces. Later, Burmese chronicles would remember him with the unflattering nickname Taruk Pyoming, the king who fled from Taruk or Chinese. His reign became a symbol of Pagan's final crisis. But even then, the civilization itself did not simply disappear. The Pagan capital survived. Its temples survived. Its Buddhist communities survived. And its people survived. What changed was the political order. The old center of power no longer possessed the same ability to command the entire Irrawaddy Valley. The empire fractured into competing regional centers, and gradually, political gravity began moving northward. The old empire had not been destroyed in a single dramatic moment. It was more like a great tree whose branches had slowly become independent of the trunk. The northern frontier became increasingly important, regional rulers gained autonomy, and the center of political power shifted toward the fertile region further upriver. The Pagan age was ending, but Myanmar civilization was not. And yet, something remarkable remained. The religious culture that Pagan had helped establish continued. Theravada Buddhism remained deeply embedded in the societies of Myanmar. The artistic traditions developed at Pagan continued to influence later Burmese architecture. The Burmese literary and cultural world carried forward ideas that had matured during the Pagan period. The political kingdom had declined, the civilization had not. This is perhaps the most important distinction to remember. Pagan was a political kingdom, but Pagan civilization was something larger. It was a cultural synthesis of Buddhism, agriculture, trade, architecture, craftsmanship, literature, and political traditions. Those traditions did not vanish when the dynasty weakened. They became part of the foundation upon which Myanmar kingdoms would be built. And so, the great Pagan kingdom passed into history. Its political power fragmented, its royal court disappeared, its rulers were replaced by new dynasties and regional powers. But the temples remained, thousands of them, silent witnesses to a civilization that had once dominated the Irrawaddy Valley. Centuries later, travelers would look across the same plain and see something extraordinary. They would see the physical remains of a vanished kingdom. But for the people who continued to live, worship, and farm here, Pagan was never entirely lost. The temples remained part of the landscape. The stories remained part of the culture. And the religious traditions continued for generations to generation. The Pagan kingdom had fallen, but its legacy had become permanent. Its greatest monuments would eventually become symbols not merely of a lost medieval kingdom, but of Myanmar itself. And in the centuries to come, the forgotten capital would slowly be rediscovered. The golden age of Pagan had ended, but the story of Pagan itself was far from over. Because centuries after the royal courts disappeared, a new generation would arrive to study the monuments, photograph them, preserve them, and eventually bring travelers from around the world to stand among the temples. In chapter 7, we leave the medieval kingdom behind and follow Pagan into the modern age, from forgotten ruins to one of Asia's great archaeological landscapes. Chapter 7, Pagan Reborn, from Forgotten Capital to World Heritage. For centuries after the fall of the Pagan kingdom, the great capital was no longer the center of an empire. The royal court was gone, the political power had moved elsewhere, but the temples remained. Across the dry plains of central Myanmar, thousands of brick monuments stood beneath the tropical sun, surrounded by villages, fields, and palm trees. Pagan had become a place of memory, and slowly it began to attract the attention of people far beyond Myanmar. European travelers began recording their impressions of the ancient monuments. By the 19th century, accounts and sketches of Pagan were circulating beyond Myanmar. The ruins fascinated visitors because they seemed to reveal an entire civilization preserved in brick. Temples stretched across the horizon, ancient inscriptions survive on stone, murals remain hidden inside dark chambers, and everywhere there were traces of a sophisticated Buddhist culture that had flourished centuries earlier. The colonial period brought a new phase of archaeological interest. British scholars and administrators began documenting Pagan's inscriptions, monuments, and Buddhist art. Maps were drawn, ancient texts were studied, monuments were photographed. The landscape that had once been understood primarily through religious tradition was increasingly being examined as an archaeological record. Photography changed the way the world saw Pagan. For the first time, images of the temples could travel far beyond the Irrawaddy Valley. The monuments that had stood quietly for centuries could now appear in books, newspapers, museums, and scholarly publications thousands of kilometers away. Pagan was becoming an archaeological treasure of international significance. But preservation was never straightforward. The monuments of Bagan stand in an earthquake-prone region. Earthquakes had damaged them repeatedly over the centuries, and modern conservation introduced its own difficulties. The Great Earthquake of 1975 caused severe damage across the archaeological zone. In the decades that followed, many monuments underwent restoration. But some of those interventions would later become controversial because they did not always follow modern conservation principles. Then, in 2016, another major earthquake struck Myanmar. The magnitude 6.8 earthquake damaged almost 400 monuments at Bagan, according to UNESCO's emergency assessment. Once again, the ancient temples faced the forces that had threatened them for centuries. But this time, international conservation specialists and Myanmar authorities worked together to assess the damage and develop long-term recovery measures. The earthquake also highlighted an uncomfortable truth. Preserving Pagan is not simply a matter of repairing old buildings. It means protecting an entire landscape. The temples existed along villages, roads, agricultural land, monasteries, and modern tourism infrastructure. People still live here. People still worship here. And people still depend upon this landscape for their livelihood. Bagan is not a museum sealed behind glass. It is a living space. That distinction became particularly important when Bagan was finally recognized by UNESCO. In 2019, Bagan was inscribed on the World Heritage List. The designation recognized the extraordinary concentration of Buddhist architecture and art, but also the wider cultural traditions that have continued across the landscape. UNESCO described Bagan as a sacred landscape containing temples, stupas, monasteries, pilgrimage places, archaeological remains, fresco, and sculptures. Today, Bagan is one of Myanmar's great cultural destinations. Visitors come to see the temples, they come to study the murals and architecture, they come to experience the extraordinary landscape of the ancient capital, and many arrive simply to stand quietly among the monuments and imagine the civilization that created them. The scene has changed dramatically since the days of Anawrahta, but the temples remained. And perhaps nowhere is the transformation more striking than at sunrise. The same landscape that once witnessed royal processions, Buddhist ceremonies, and the construction of monumental temples now receive visitors from around the world. The temples emerge from the morning mist, the Irrawaddy glimmers in the distance, and the silhouette of Pagan's monuments recall the kingdom that once stood here. But Pagan's greatest legacy is not simply the number of temples that survive, it is the cultural world they represent, the Theravada Buddhist traditions, the architectural forms, the craftsmanship, the inscriptions, the stories, the relationships between rulers, religion, and society. All of these threads continue long after the kingdom itself disappeared. And perhaps that is why Pagan remains so powerful. We often think of ancient civilization as something that ended, a kingdom rises, a capital flourishes, a dynasty falls, and eventually all that remains are ruins. But Pagan tells a different story. The kingdom disappeared, the culture endured. More than 800 years after the height of the Pagan kingdom, its monuments still shape the identity of the landscape. The temples are still places of worship. The monasteries still serve Buddhist communities. The pilgrims still make offerings. And local people still live among the monuments. This is what makes Bagan different from a city that has simply become an archaeological ruin. There is another lesson in Pagan survival. Civilizations are not preserved only in stone. They survive in memory, in rituals, in language, in stories passed from one generation to another. In the way people continue to understand the landscape around them, the monuments may be ancient, but their meanings can remain alive. And yet, the future of Bagan is not guaranteed. The archaeological zone faces earthquakes, weather slowly wears down brick and plaster. Tourism brings economic opportunities, but also pressure. Modern development must be carefully managed. And conservation requires a delicate balance between protecting the past and allowing communities to live in the present. UNESCO specifically identifies tourism and development pressures, environmental pressures, and natural disasters as among the major factors affecting the site's conservation. The story of Pagan, therefore, does not truly end with its decline, nor does it end with the discovery of its ruins. It continues every time a monk lights a candle inside an ancient temple, every time a conservator carefully repairs a damaged wall, every time a local family makes an offering, and every time a visitor looks across the plain and realizes that these temples were once part of a living civilization. Pagan began as a kingdom, it became an empire, it became a center of Buddhist civilization, it declined, it was forgotten by the wider world, and then slowly it was remembered. Today, Bagan stands not merely as the remains of a vanished dynasty, but as one of the great surviving landscapes of Asian civilization. And perhaps this is the most fitting way to remember Pagan, not as a civilization that vanished, but as a civilization that left something behind. a landscape of brick and gold, a tradition of Buddhist devotion, a record of artistic genius, and thousands of monuments that continue to speak silently across the centuries. Bagan's story is therefore not simply the story of a kingdom, it is the story of how a civilization can outlive the rulers who created it. And as we look across the temples of Bagan today, we are not looking at a dead civilization, we are looking at one whose echoes are still very much alive. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of Bagan. My name is Timothy, and I hope you have enjoyed discovering the extraordinary story of one of Southeast Asia's greatest civilization. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the Asian Civilization channel. There are many more stories waiting to be discovered, from the ancient capitals of Asia to the kingdoms, peoples, and ideas that shape our world. Until our next journey through the civilizations of Asia, I'm Timothy. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.